This conversation between Sharon Lockhart and Manuel Cirauqui. Sharon is the artist whose work is presented as from today in the film and video space, and Manuel Cirauqui is the curator of this program that the museum has been carrying out for the last 7 years. And with this work with rotation notation, which is the third that completes this year's program for 2021, where there have been two very specific characteristics. On the one hand, we have the three artists responsible for the projects that have been presented in this space are women, Reynolds, Thingolea, and now Sharon Lockhart, and all of these works have a connection, as Sharon and Manuel will be pointing out. They are connected to the movement of the body with choreography and the relationship with dance and music. And in this particular instance, the work by Sharon Lockhart, Rotation Notation, is based on her contact and on her relationship with a choreographer called Noa Eshkol. And with this system of notation of movement developed by Noa Eshkol and Abraham Bachmann, who designed this notation system that makes it possible to reflect all the movements, all the possible movements of a human body through that system or that register. And that is when it's not only possible to establish a choreography, but also to perform an analysis of movement in animals and humans, and also address behavioral problems that affect movement, like Asperger's syndrome or the autism syndrome. But they also represent, and this is what has brought about a work like this that you can see in the film and video space, a work that is a video, but it's also a number of 4 photographs that can be seen just outside the film and video gallery. And it's very fortunate to have Sharon here tonight speaking to Manuel. And I would like to thank the Foundation Decent 21, which is the owner of this work, and I'd like to thank you for your collaboration with the museum to transform this into something tangible in the film and video program. Thank you very much, and I hope that you will enjoy this conversation. Thank you.
Muy bien. Bueno, León.
Thank you, Juan Ignacio, for that introduction, and many thanks to all of you for being here tonight, and especially many thanks to Sharon, who's not only come to hold this conversation, but she's also here to install these pieces. And in fact, I think I'm going to switch into English now, because there's an interpretation system that you can use should you need it, and that's how Sharon will understand.
That's okay. So I was thanking you for being here,
okay.
And I was reflecting on the fact that it's your first physical installation since the beginning of the pandemic, so it's quite special, and I think we can definitely feel the difference about installing an exhibition with continuity between the work and the body. And this show is very much about the body and very much about the physicality of the image. It is important to look at this image that is on the cover of the event and presiding over this conversation now for various reasons. All good? The first reason is that we would like to pay tribute to Ruthie, who is the dancer you see here. She passed away last year, and when she performed for Sharon's work, I think she was something like 74 years old. Mm-hmm. And it's really stunning, the purity of the movement, the clarity, and the stoic gesture is very remarkable. And of course, we invite you to see the show if you haven't seen it yet. Ruthie was one of the main dancers in the Noa Eshkol group, and her dancing alone is something that is not obvious, and that is very related to the way Sharon Lockhart redefined the practices of the Noa Eshkol group through her interpretation, her dialogue with the group members. And this is a body of work. It's not just the works we're showing. It's a large body of works that started when Sharon Lockhart was investigating in Israel and came into contact with this very, at the time, derelict archive, almost abandoned, almost forgotten. Thanks to the work of Sharon Lockhart, Noa Eshkol has also come back to people's attention, both in the world of dance and contemporary art, as we will see, also textiles. So what we will do here is we'll try to contextualize both the works we're presenting, the series, and Sharon's practice as a whole. And I know Sharon doesn't like to talk about her own practice. She loves to talk about other things, but not her practice. So I'll be forcing her to release some key information about all these wonderful works. I want to thank everybody who came to this event, and particularly TVA 21, the collection who lent the works and with whom we collaborated for this presentation. And the Wellbeing Project was also an important interlocutor for the project as a whole. And I would like to thank Neugerim Schneider, actually, Sharon's gallery in Berlin, because they were extremely helpful in many aspects of the project, but also to gather the materials that we're showing today. So maybe we can see the first image, and from then on, I think I will have to command this very sophisticated system I have never used before, so I'll try to do my best. But the first thing I wanted to point out is actually the physicality of these volumes that are used as screens, but are not just screens, Sharon, and you were really insisting on the fact that they need to have a presence that is sculptural, that has a connection to minimal art, and that has also a proportional relation to the bodies of the dancers, but also to the rooms in which they are installed. And so, yeah, as a way of entry into the conversation, how talking about the physicality of the works and the series as a whole, you know, physically and with their weight, their dimensions.
Well, I've always thought about the context of work, whether it's film that's made specifically for the cinema, and that is a physical experience of like coming in today, where it's a collective experience, and there's a durational aspect. And that carries over into, like we were talking about photography and how the body relates to it physically based on the height. So I've always thought of things like that. And the minimalism thing, thank you very much for bringing that up. In the film, I wanted to marry the textiles, Noa Eshkol's textiles, with the dances, which never happened before. Noa was very against bringing them together. They were two very different practices. And the dancers did not really understand conceptually what it was that I was thinking of bringing them together and having these physical volumes within the film. So each carpet that I've chosen, there's, I think, 9 carpets and 5 dances, so there's 5 of these volumes. Each of the carpets were on their own volume and had a relation to the space of the dance as I saw it. It wasn't until the day of filming, really, that the dancers came in and they saw the set and they were like, oh, we get it, you know. But they said if Noa was alive, this never would have happened. She would never have allowed it. Yeah.
So, in fact, I wanted to compare these shots of the installation with the 5 dances and the carpet as a background, and this image, which is from the work we are presenting. because there are two aspects to the operation that you're carrying out. One has to do with the collective level of the dance and the community. And the other one has to do with the abstraction of these volumes that in the 5 dances with the group were occupied by textiles, and here they're just abstract gray volumes. So on these two levels, first, how did you convince Ruthie to dance alone? Because this is not normal for the Noa Eshkol group.
And not at all, no. Well, first, Ruthie was the most humble person ever. She was the backbone of the house. I mean, there were a lot of egos involved in the house of Eshkol, but Ruthie did not have one, and I've never met anybody like her before. So the fact that I wanted to heighten her was something that she was very uncomfortable with to begin with, but also that Noa believed that a dance begins with 2 people and never one. So I mean, a lot of my work, I'm kind of honoring or paying tribute to people, and I saw this as honoring Ruthie as someone who kind of kept everything together. So the volumes are based on her proportions of her body, her wingspan, and her height. And together we chose 4 exercises, and they're called exercises and not dances because this is something that's performed daily as a practice. And the different compositions of the volumes are in relation to the dances. So there's like this one's a horizontal plane, so she dances from left to right. And then there's other ones that she's moving this way, and then some that she's moving circular. Yeah.
And when you prepare the setup, how did you work with these gray volumes that are so imposing and at the same time so blank?
These?
The gray volumes, yeah. I mean, how would you call them? The geometry of the stage, the sculptures, but they are not real sculptures. There's some sort of setting. How did you approach that? I guess you had to build them. You had to measure them.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about that process?
Yeah, I mean, we had a great team there in Israel. They're these big square boxes.
How did you come up with the scenery of these volumes?
I did it with little matchboxes. So yeah, I mean, I just made a mock-up with matchboxes, and I work with these 2 architects in Los Angeles, so we figured that out together. And when I'm making work, I usually am working with them, thinking about the installation. So I always knew that the installation would also have a sculptural element. Yeah. Does that answer?
Not yet.
Okay.
So you moved from exhibiting the textiles into these gray volumes. But I'm intrigued by the fact that first you operate this shift from the group to the solo dancer, and then you operate the shift from the scenery. That makes sense because it's the context, is the labor, and we will look at the textiles in a moment, but this is without the textiles. And in fact, we're not showing the textiles in the exhibition to make a point about the fact that there's a certain level of abstraction that is reached.
Yes.
And so I'm intrigued by the neutral volumes and what they can do in comparison or in contrast with the dancing body and the solo dancer.
Well, I also think the silence plays into that.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, not that you responded to it, but let's move forward. Speaking of abstraction, then, let me see. Now we do this, and now we do this. There you go. So, on display in the exhibition, there are these photos, which are a series of groups of photos based on the typosphere and its positions and rotations. Every sphere is like the framework where all the movements can take place. It's basically a pure potency. And within that framework, Noa Eshkol and Abraham Bachman would establish, let's say, chart the movement of a limb as an itinerary through this access with mesh. So there is this encounter between the soft and the hard, and also the visible and the invisible. When you discovered these materials, I guess they were not in perfect shape. How did you come up with the idea of, like documenting them systematically, almost as if you were carrying out some sort of archiving, like re-archiving the archive or something like that?
Well, when I first saw them, it was in the house the first day that I went there, and the two primary dancers did a performance for me, and it was completely silent except for a metronome. So I had never seen anything like this ever. And there were these 5 spheres like hanging up like with a bunch of stuff, really neglected, because these were tools. These were tools for inventing this system of movement. And I saw them as sculptures immediately, and I kept saying, those sculptures, and this wasn't how they were seen. They were seen as a means to an end. And what I wanted to do was bring them into movement, and through strobographic photography, like Muybridge or Edgerton, we photographed them as they were rotating. So, yeah, I mean, basically it's very hard to understand, but it's the movement of any limb based on the joint. So it's showing these movements here.
It's conical movement.
Yeah,
it's based all in cone. Yeah, combinations of cones, and also the mesh can move from one cone to the other and make a complex sequence. Now, the question of movement notation and the system of reference in the Eshkol-Bachmann movement notation, in a way appears as a parallel to another form of segmenting and analyzing movement, which you had already been working on through the means of photography and film. You mentioned Edward Muybridge because, of course, he developed stop-motion photography as a key passage from photography to cinema. Now, you are working with another system that in a way overlaps in this analytical impulse. So what I would like to propose is that we move in that direction, but at the same time, there was something mysterious. If these were not sculptures, the Noa Eshkol group was also doing something else that was not a primary form of art, but some sort of like side activity, which were their textiles that they call wall carpets. So I would like us to see these non-sculptures alongside the wall carpets. And here would be one.
The thing that really fascinated me, I mean, I went to Israel to research textiles, but I never in a million years thought I would come across these. Noa basically would collect fabric, and anyone who came to the house would have to bring something. She'd pick up umbrellas that were discarded on the street, old skirts, army blankets, and she would lay them out at night. She would never cut them, and I thought this was such a strict rule for something that had so much chance, which goes against everything in her notation system.
And they wouldn't weave either.
Weave.
They were not weaving, and they were not cutting or intervening what they received. Just
placing them together. And then in the morning, usually Ruthie would come in and pin them together, put them away, and then someone would sew them later on. And there were something like 1,500 there. So there were quite a few. And yeah, and through looking at that and that archive, I chose the 9 that go with the 5 dances. And she did title them.
Yes, in fact, this one is titled Red Sunset.
Yeah.
And the previous one was Circle of Fire. And the previous one was Aunt Leah's Tree.
It's kind of surprising when you think of Noa as giving those kinds of titles. She was a very, very strong woman who didn't really leave much to interpretation. Like the dances are exact. There's no, like your personality doesn't come in at all. It's a formula that you follow.
So when you encountered Noa Eshkol's work and her archive, she had passed away recently, I
The
guess.
year
It was
before.
2007 or 8, and you were working just 1 year after. But you found the community fully engaged in the continuation of their practice. Is this correct?
They still were practicing 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. So that also really inspired me to think about like the kind of culture we live in where you're just producing. It's like producing. I mean, even as an artist, exhibiting, producing. And here were these women that practiced without Noa even there, and for 40 years when Noa was there, and there were no performances. There was no, there wasn't like you're working towards something. You're just practicing. So
And were they still carrying out the textile work?
They were still sewing them. Yeah.
So I think now we have, very briefly, but we have addressed these two lines. On the one hand, there's the movement notation, the analytical drive that overlaps with your own analytical way of filming. Or, I know you're influenced by structuralist cinema. And on the other hand, you have the collective work, the practices that are at the same time labor and leisure. They are, let's say, love, but also they are production. And with these two parallel entries, what I would like is that we see some excerpts of your films. Some of them are, well, more than 20 years old. And of course, the Noa Eshkol series is 10 years from now, but it feels really present. I think through these works we can really look at the totality of your practice, even if your practice is very wide, and there are a lot of fascinating things we will not be able to address today. But what I'm going to propose is that we see a first excerpt. I guess we will see Gogoshaoka.
Okay.
Gogoshaoka. So yes, we will have the lights off and see this first excerpt. dejamos aquí porque entre la lluvia.
Camera, and then they just keep running, and then all of a sudden their running just stops off camera at the same time, and then there's just a little silence.
Yeah, and this presence, absence, contrast, I mean, of course it appears in Pine Flat. I mean, you always play with that. I have the feeling that it's always in your films. It's like weight of absence, weight of presence, and how you like make space in the same frame for both weights to take over.
It was pretty wild watching that. I mean,
It's 97.
Yeah, I mean, just seeing Ruthie again, I hadn't seen it in a long time, and just remembering it. And of course, once I make something, I move on to the next thing. But seeing this, after just talking about Ruthie and this idea of exercise, and, you know, there's no game. The film's an hour long, and it's just choreographed exercise. Yeah, it never even occurred to me.
Well, it seemed really obvious.
Yeah.
But it's great that you actually have been just going forward without noticing. But I think the connections are super present. And this idea of discipline that is really relevant for the Noa Eshkol group, also for the basketball players in Gosogaoka. Ahora, si os parece, los dos vídeos siguientes ponemos 5 minutos y luego 5 minutos el siguiente. Y el micrófono, que si tosemos se va a oír mucho. Gracias.
Have a nice weekend, huh, guys?
You're getting the boys back next week.
No, just Ronnie. I'll stand.
That's not what Al just told me.
Oh, he changed his mind? Oh, yeah?
You're lucky. No, he's lucky.
nice weekend, huh, guys?
You're getting the boys back next week.
No, just Ronnie. I'll stay in.
That's not what Al just told me. Oh, he changed
Oh, he
his
changed his
mind.
mind? Oh, yeah?
You're lucky. No, he's lucky.
Vamos a dar un poco de contexto a la situación porque
As the videos are in separate files, they're not going through a PowerPoint, but rather they're going through a different kind of program, and well, they seem to be jumping around. But what you have seen now is an abstract of one of the films called, I think you said, Exit, and in it, Sharon Lockhart in the year 2008.
Exit is from 2008, I think. And you shot the exit of the factory, I think 110 years after the Lumiere brothers shot the exit of their factory in Lyon.
Yeah.
So it is a direct, let's say, confrontation of two moments in cinema and two moments in work history, in labor history.
But I
now,
shot from the inside.
And then, exactly, well, you
Yeah.
had the inside of the factory and the workers exiting. And then, in a moment of lunch break, the video that has this title, Lunch Break, produces a different cinematic operation. This is what we will now try to watch. A ver, control, porfa, ¿podéis pasar el siguiente vídeo? Los 5 primeros minutos, por favor. Gracias. So we're back, and that was lunch break. So again, I think there are many things in common through this analytical lens of movement, and it's almost extreme through this like rarefied speed of the camera and going through that corridor, and when this woman's eating, and you can feel that you're almost about to stop at some sort of frame, and you don't. It just keeps going, and so it changes the way you can match the speed of your thinking with the speed of the images, which is something actually that is very manipulative in Hollywood cinema. Like, you never have more than 3-second shots because they need to time your thinking.
Yeah.
You do just the exact opposite. And you actually live in California, which I think is not unrelated. So there will be a lot to say about this really stoic and structuralist way of shooting, but you already chose the scenery and you match it with something that was like, it was letting the entire moment into the camera, but it was not to do it from a neutral point. You would show the mechanics of the camera. So how did you get yourself into those settings? Interested in labor, you were coming from works like Pine Flat or Gosokaoka, and then suddenly you're in the factory actually somewhere near your hometown. How do you get into this labor world and then
Well, Pine Flat, I was making so much work out of the country, and then Pine Flat is just a few hours from Los Angeles, but it really reminded me of where I grew up in Maine. And that was all about free time in childhood. And and then I started thinking about free time in adulthood and how people fought for an 8-hour workday and a 30-minute lunch break. And so it just led me into all of this research and, and about industrial labor. And, oh, I'm so sorry. And this was right before the market crash. I mean, it was like so many things changed right after this work was made. And this was one of the only places that I could find that had, you know, there were 6,000 people in this workforce, and they're building warships. So this is an industry that's not dying. Yeah, but the film was about free time. And so, yeah, the film goes down the assembly hall where the workers have made their own area to have lunch to save time from going to a cafeteria or leaving, because that takes time to get there. And the corridor goes for about a quarter of a mile, and the camera moves for 80 minutes. The camera, it's a 10-minute take on 35 millimeter, and then we interpolated it, so for every 8 frames, for every frame, there's 8 more frames.
And this is a related series that you did on Dwayne Hansen's sculptures. You rephotographed, you photographed the scene, and it's disturbing because it's almost like there is a, like, what is not real is the backdrop and the frame, regardless of how much realism Hansen sculptures has. So, but you know, because these are sculptures, and there is something sculptural since the beginning of this conversation going on in your work. I think in works like Lunch Break, what you are operating is a sculptural like twist or some sort of forcing sculpture as a property of images by way of repetition and slowness. And so, to what extent the sculptural gaze in, you know, like for instance, the volumes of projection screens in Noa Eshkol works, to what extent is that something that you keep bringing into your film works? To what extent do you see the connection between film and sculpture? Is that circumstantial? Or is this something that you need to show the real volume of film as some sort of weight physically in space?
Okay, kind of lost your question because I was just listening to it,
Sculpture and film, and how film can be physically present by means of slowness, repetition, and if making film a sculptural presence in the space is something that you try systematically, or is it just incidental? For instance, in the Noa Eshkol work, it's very clear, but perhaps in Exit, it's
No, Exit and Lunch Break. I mean, Lunch Break had a 65-foot volume that went down the center of this, like the Secession was the first place. And it wasn't a black box at all. It was, big white, like, structure in the middle of the space, and it was really echoing the hallway. And then Exit was in the last room of the Secession on the bottom floor on purpose, because after you see Exit, you exit the space. And so I really wanted to bring that in, and that also had a volume that you had to walk around, so you became aware of your movement, because Exit is 5 working days, and it's everyday movement. It's a choreography in itself. So, yeah, so it's always been there, and moving into sculpture, like literally now, is pretty exciting. And Hansen, I can't remember when I did this. If it
2002, 2003, I believe.
Oh, so it was much more
It
before.
predates.
I guess I was starting to I don't know what I was doing. But I had begun looking at Dwayne Hansen because of his representation of working class America. And I photographed it from 4 sides during an installation in a museum. So there's 2 workers with the workers. And yeah, I think this is one of Hansen's best sculptures as well.
And your piece really adds a twist to Hansen's disturbance of the exhibition order by way of realism, right? There is something interesting that your Exit piece made me realize about the original Lumiere brothers factory exit scene, which is that, well, if in a way it is the first movie ever made, apparently it's not entirely true, like there are simultaneous achievements in this field, but let's say it's one of the first, and it stands as the first. Well, they filmed the exit of the workers, which is capricious because they could have filmed the workers working, but this would have been redundant, and I think it's redundant because of the mechanicism of cinema itself. So I realized that by considering your piece and not necessarily the Lumiere brothers one. So we're moving through these works, and now I would like to jump to a work that is 10 years after Lunch Break.
Okay.
So we're sort of moving through decades, and it's this series, the 9 Sticks in 9 Movements, where sculpture is enacted in a particular way. There's an analytical point of view on movement. Here it's a photographic series. I could ask you many questions. One is, why didn't you make a film? Or maybe you are making the film, or maybe it was made and I didn't see it. But it's a photo series. These are 9, and I will show the 9 as you speak and respond to this. But I think I see a piece of all the works we mentioned in this very, very simple exercise. And I guess she's doing exercise or showing poses. Can you tell us more about it? I don't know much about this one, and I'm curious.
Yeah, it's called 9 Sticks and 9 Movements, I think. I can't remember. And she's actually, these are bronze pieces, and so it's very much about, unlike the spheres that are caught in motion with the strobe, these are all very held poses. They're much more sculptural. They're very long exposures. And the sticks range in weight, and you can really see it physically in the way she's holding things. The imagery is sourced from all of my research, so they're coming from very different places, like art history, politics,
Martial arts.
farming, yeah.
Any samurai like user guides? I mentioned Yves Klein and his judo books.
Yeah, well, that,
But you don't own any of those.
no. So I worked with a performer, and we worked out all of the movements. I had many, many sticks, and from those sticks we chose 9. They're all, there's 3 different kinds of wood that are represented. There's manzanita, buckeye, and black walnut. And this is the only one that's high polish. And that one's about 26 pounds, I think. That's the only one that shows her face. This one's one of my favorites. You just like the veins in her arm, like holding it, I think are really beautiful. And some of the poses are also from dance, I forgot. And then the sticks, once I had chosen, I chose the sticks to make an arrangement. Maybe that's easier to explain. And then once I chose the sticks, I had the movements in my mind. So the whole series is called Movements and Variations. So these are the movements, and the variations are what I do with the bronze.
And I think this is the last one. So were you coming in and out of the Eshkol research, or you had already come to a closure and then you were starting afresh and suddenly there are all these resemblances?
I mean, between Eshkol and this, there's like 10 years of work in Poland. So yeah, it's like I said, once I finish something, but then obviously it has connections that I forget about. So yeah, this was a very freeing project. It was, I wasn't working with a huge community and a big crew. I wasn't in another country. It was really something I was working on in my studio with an ikebana artist for the arrangement of the bronzes and the performer for the poses, and a foundry. But yeah, it was very, very different. And I think since then, my practice is really kind of shifting.
And so now we're back to Ruthie and her movements, and it's not the movements and the sticks and the variations, but it's the movement notation and the rotations. So before I ask you too many questions, perhaps we should open up the conversation to everybody who is here. I think we have like, 10 minutes left. So why don't we take some questions? ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿Las podéis hacer en castellano? Yo traduzco, por favor. ¿Sí? ¿Allí? Espera, que llegue el micrófono, yo creo, ¿verdad? Va llegando.
Okay. The question is, I would like to know what was the reason or the starting point that you become interested about Noa works.
What was the reason?
I didn't say reason, but it can be the starting point, reason, or whatever that you started to become interested about Noa's work.
Well, I mean, early on, like Goshigoka, I was working with a choreographer, and my work is very influenced by postmodern dance and everyday movement, and minimalism, and scores and notations and these things. And so when I had the chance to meet these women at Noa's house, it wasn't planned. It was really by chance. It was something that it moved me immediately. And I was shocked that nobody knew who she was. And, like Simone Forti had heard of her because she spent a little time in Israel. Noa called her the little one. but yeah, it just seemed like her practice was so radical that it should be known within the context of dance.
And it's true that there are recordings of Noa Eshkol dances that you can find online, but your films are so different.
Yeah.
It really, there is a gap between the way you decided to shoot and the way it was documented historically. How did you get there to like be so clear about the difference between documenting and your own filming of them?
Well, I liked that there was a, the whole project is about authorship, I think, and it's like, what are the boundaries of, what is mine, what is Noah's? And, I saw this as a 2-woman exhibition, but obviously it's all through my lens. Yeah, I wasn't interested in making a documentary film. That would have been something very different. Yeah, it was through my eyes, through my filter and my interpretation. That's why the women in the beginning were like, the carpets, the wall carpets on sculptures behind us, they just, like, it just would never have happened, And I liked bringing, now that I'm thinking, movements and variations, it's with the bronzes and the photographs, it's kind of similar in thinking.
Very much.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I guess making art is always necessarily a confrontation with authorship, because to any extent it's always an artist mobilizing the work of others, or like a certain memory of other works too. So in their case, I mean, they are mobilizing Noa Eshkol's teachings and system, and it's also authorship opened up by the fact that it's a community and they are their own bodies. So I think it's very important for this to be emphasized, but at the same time, I cannot conceive of an artwork where this question is not an issue. And you're right when you say there is a 2-person show, but at the same time there could be a misunderstanding in the way making it a 2-person show is like, circumventing the real question, which is it's actually a 1-person show, but there's a crowd there, like pretty much in every artwork, right?
I mean, collaborating with someone who's dead.
Also that. So, ¿una otra pregunta? ¿Comentario? Anímense. ¿Sí, por ahí? ¿Alguien? So, muy bien, lo vamos a dejar aquí. I would like to thank you for your presence in this fantastic show. I hope everybody saw it. I'm going to switch to Spanish to say goodbye. Gracias a todas y a todos por...
Thank you all very much for coming here tonight, and my apologies for the technical problems. I'm afraid that we just couldn't sort things out, but I hope that it's been worthwhile. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.